So our next speaker, originally from the Bahamas, is Dr. Charlotte Paige Rolle. She's an infectious disease specialist and the Director of Research Operations at Orlando Immunology Center. She is a graduate of the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine and obtained a master's in public health at the Harvard School of Medicine. She completed a fellowship at Emory University in Atlanta and has conducted research in various areas from HIV testing laws to PrEP, publishing many papers. Her presentation this morning is on the truth about COVID-19 vaccines. Dr. Charlotte Paige Rolle, please. Welcome.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much to the conference organizers for having me. I'm super excited to be chatting with you guys today. I'm actually going to try to share my screen just because, oh, never mind. I think the clicker, the mechanism for me to advance my slides is not connected. So if someone could allow me to share my screen, that would be great. I do have my slideshow pulled up. All right, let's try this. All right, can someone confirm that they can see my screen or maybe put in the chat?
Indeed, we can.
Okay, terrific. Thanks so much. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Charlotte Rolle. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you guys so much for having me. And I'm excited to be discussing the truth about COVID-19 vaccines with you guys. I know it's a hot topic around the world. And so looking forward to our discussion and answering any questions that you guys may have. All right, so quick agenda. Going to briefly go over why we still need a COVID-19 vaccine. Believe it or not, that is still a hot topic of debate among some of the scientific community. We're going to briefly discuss mechanism of action, the different types of COVID-19 vaccines, address a few rumors about Operation Warp Speed and what it was created to actually do. And then we're actually going to just jump into the clinical trial data. I'm going to briefly review the clinical trial data from the EUA approved COVID-19 vaccines, and then also going to touch actually on 2 clinical trials from vaccines that I understand have been distributed to the Caribbean. And so that is the Chinese Sinopharm vaccine, and then some of the islands also have India's Covaxin vaccine as well. I'm going to give you some hot new data about the variants that's kind of just coming out slowly from the CDC, and then going to end with some frequently asked questions. And hopefully these address most of the questions, but I will try to leave a few minutes for any additional questions that you guys may have. So jumping right in, why do we still need a COVID-19 vaccine? I hope that this is obvious, but just in case it's not, here are a good couple of reasons. As you guys know, this is a global pandemic and has been responsible for millions, hundreds of millions of infections worldwide, and approximately, actually the number is probably right now around 3.4 million deaths, because this was the data when I created this slide set. As you guys are fully aware, there are no prediction tools to determine who's going to have a severe infection. And so I think as an infectious disease specialist, I've seen the 106-year-old grandma with the COPD walk out of the hospital. And then I've also seen the 22-year-old football player from, college pass away. And so there's really, we do have risk factors for whom might get severe disease, but we've all seen these rules be broken at some point during the pandemic. As you guys know, there are currently no FDA-approved treatment or prevention options for COVID-19. We do have EUA approval for some of our products, but EUA approval and FDA approval are obviously not the same. And then just a quick reminder, I know this was actually like a whole year ago now, where we were at the height of this pandemic. But even at the height of the pandemic, when things were shut down, where people just were not exiting their houses, when business activities completely ceased, we actually still continue to have new cases of COVID-19 every day. So clearly we need something else, to really kind of jump in and help, because even at our maximal efforts without a vaccine, that was still not enough to curb this infection. And then, as an ID doc, I do have to say vaccination is one of the oldest prevention strategies that we've used worldwide. It's proven to be highly both cost effective and is generally quite safe. So here's a little bit about the virus. Sorry to show this so early in the morning, but I only show it to, point out the reason that the virus is called coronavirus is because it legitimately looks like a crown. The little spikes that you guys see there in red are spike protein. Spike protein does bind to the ACE2 receptor on human cells. And you guys know ACE2 is found all over, right? On the heart, on the brain, on the kidneys, et cetera. And so that is actually probably what makes this disease just so devastating, is because we have viral infection of a variety of cells in the body. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen and taken care of patients with COVID-19 in the hospital and have seen the multi-organ system failure that really results from this disease. It's because of this sort of wide distribution of ACE. And it is the spike protein that obviously binds to ACE and mediates viral entry into human cells. So the clinical course, I think probably maybe some of you have seen this slide from me before if you've attended a talk I've given. I've been using this slide since the beginning and I love this slide because it's really so accurate, and it actually explains why we continue to lose some patients to this disease despite our best efforts, right? And it's because there's actually kind of two phases to this infection. The first is the viral response phase, where you have millions of copies, of virus replicating. And at that point, that is when you're supposed to throw remdesivir at someone. But guess what? During the viral replication phase, most patients are actually asymptomatic. There's not a whole lot going on. And so we think that this place where remdesivir really, really works is actually when people don't really have much in the way of symptoms. When people actually start getting sick is when the body's immune response actually jumps in and is like, oh my God, there's a foreign invader. You got to do something. And you guys get all the downstream inflammatory pathways being activated. And obviously that's when people, start becoming short of breath and start mounting a fever response. And you guys get that sort of cytokine storm that you see in patients who are hospitalized in the ICU with this infection. And, it's kind of interesting because obviously remdesivir is actually EUA approved for patients who are hospitalized requiring oxygen. But I think a lot of us sort of who study the basic science of the disease, a lot of us think that remdesivir probably is being given quite late in the course when that happens. But, we do have some new therapies at this point. We have the EUA approved monoclonal antibodies. I'm not going to bother to say these names this morning. It's just a little too early and I just haven't drank enough coffee for that. But there is an Eli Lilly product and there's also a Regeneron product that has EUA approval. And then I'm not sure if a lot of people know about this. It actually doesn't seem to be widely talked about, but there's a JAK-STAT inhibitor called baricitinib that does have EUA approval to be given in combination with remdesivir for hospitalized patients. I know a lot of hospitals are not using it. It's a very expensive drug and it's very hard to get your hands on baricitinib. I know personally at the hospital that I staff, we run out of baricitinib every other week, but it actually does have an EUA approval in combination with remdesivir for those patients requiring oxygen. So how do the COVID-19 vaccines work? Here are sort of a depiction of the three main types of COVID-19 vaccines. You have your mRNA vaccine, your recombinant protein vaccine, and then your viral vector vaccine. And essentially, they kind of all work the same way. Both the mRNA and the viral vector vaccines, they contain the genetic code for spike protein. And so when they get injected, they instruct your cells to produce spike protein so that you make antibodies and you get T cells that, for memory response to spike protein, such that if they ever see it in the future, they're primed and they're ready to fight off that infection. Recombinant protein vaccines actually just give someone recombinant spike protein, right? And that is actually really classic vaccine technology. So your hepatitis A and B, your Twinrix vaccines, those are recombinant protein vaccines. And I think this is the kind of vaccine that a lot of people think of, but there are currently no EUA approved recombinant protein vaccines currently available. There's only the mRNA and the viral vector vaccines that actually have an EUA approval. So this is just another slide to basically say what I just said, and it doesn't really matter which vaccine you're giving, which technology you're using, the end result is the same, right? The body somehow gets some sort of instruction to produce spike protein unless you're just giving sort of recombinant spike protein. And why would we bother to use a viral vector vaccine or an mRNA vaccine when we can just give someone recombinant spike protein? That's a question I get a lot. And the reason is because when you're forcing the body to actually produce the spike protein and then forcing the immune system to actually respond, the immunogenicity or the strength of your immune response is actually generally thought to be higher with mRNA vaccines and viral vector vaccines. It's a more efficient way of producing a huge amount of spike protein, if that makes sense, as opposed to just giving someone recombinant spike protein. And so this is the technology that's currently available right now. And many of us who study vaccines do generally believe that these induce stronger immune responses. So what are the currently available COVID-19 vaccines? You guys noticed there's the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. These are both RNA vaccines. They are both 2-dose vaccines. Pfizer currently is approved down to age 12, but my understanding is that they just submitted to the FDA some of their pediatric data, and so we pretty soon may see that age actually drop. Moderna did just submit to go down to 12 this week, so we may hopefully see that as well. Currently, Moderna, as you guys know, is only approved to be given to persons over the age of 18. Janssen and AstraZeneca are our current viral vector vaccines. Janssen is the only one that has an EUA approval, even though AstraZeneca has released its phase 3 clinical trial results. There are just so many currently available vaccines in the United States, and with some of the mechanisms of the clotting thrombosis that we see with the AstraZeneca and the Janssen vaccine just being poorly understood right now, the FDA is asking for a lot more information about that before it chooses to issue an EUA. And so in case some of you guys are wondering why AZ has not gotten an EUA in the US yet, it's just because the FDA essentially feels that there are a lot of other options available right now. And until we can get more information about those thrombotic events that have been observed globally, they are kind of holding off on the EUA. The company has submitted for the EUA, though it's just pending right now. Both of these vaccines actually do not have a whole lot of pediatric data. They're both only approved for 18 and up. And then you guys know that Janssen is the one that is the only vaccine that's currently single dose. For those of you who have heard of the Covishield vaccine from India, and some of the islands actually do have some Covishield, that is actually AstraZeneca's vaccine, just by a different manufacturer. If you guys hear of the AstraZeneca or SK Bio vaccine, that's the AZD vaccine, just manufactured by a German company. It's the exact same vaccine. There are currently some other viral vector vaccines that are available globally. There's the Chinese vaccine, the CanSinoBio, and then the Sputnik V from Russia. Those are both viral vector vaccines that work pretty much almost identical to the AZD vaccine. The Russian vaccine does use a different viral vector, though. And then we actually do have some globally available inactivated virus vaccines. And so that's just killed COVID-19 basically being injected in. The Chinese vaccine Sinopharm is an example of that. India's Covaxin vaccine is an inactivated viral vaccine, and then so is China's CoronaVac vaccine. And inactivated viral vaccines, that is, again, traditional vaccine technology. Every year that you guys get the flu shot, that's an inactivated viral vaccine. The only issue with inactivated viral vaccines is that definitely compared to live virus vaccines, they just don't induce that potent of an immune response. But I'm going to show you some data from Sinopharm and Covaxin that actually suggests that these two vaccines are actually quite immunogenic and do induce a very good immune response. And then currently right now, we do have Novavax and Sanofi that are still in clinical trials. They are both, Novavax is a 2-dose vaccine. Sanofi has 2 different trials going on as a single dose and then as a double dose. Novavax data actually looks very good. I'm not sure if some of you have been keeping up with what's coming out about it, but it actually does do very well against the original Wuhan strain, in addition to quite a bit of the variants. And their trial is fully enrolled. They are just waiting on their first interim analysis before submitting for the EUA. So we do expect Novavax to be the first recombinant protein vaccine that will be available on the market, hopefully before the end of the year. So Operation Warp Speed. You know, there's so many rumors and myths and this and that going around about Operation Warp Speed, but Operation Warp Speed was really an effort, you know, formed by the public health and scientific community. And all this started off was this statement that we were going to make 300 million vaccine doses by the end of the year being 2020. Obviously that did not happen. It was not successful, but that's all we were referring to when we talk about Operation Warp Speed. And there were certain things that the FDA allowed us to do to kind of make this happen, right? And we're going to get into a little bit of that on this slide. And so what are some of the common rumors you hear about OWS? Well, the first is that OWS did allow us supposedly to skip stages in development when coming out with the COVID-19 vaccines. And I just want to let you guys know that that's not true. What OWS did allow us to do was run the different stages concurrently, right? And so in clinical trials, phase 1 has to be finished before phase 2 can begin. That has to end before phase 3 can begin. What we did with COVID-19 was we realized that was not an acceptable way to proceed. This was a global pandemic that was killing hundreds and thousands of people every day. If we took 5 years to come out with a COVID-19 vaccine, that would just simply not be ethically acceptable. It just would not. It was causing too much destruction. It was ravaging communities. So we knew that we couldn't do that. So what the FDA did allow us to do was phase 1 had to be pretty much almost complete for everyone, or phase 1 efficacy data and safety had to be released. And when that was released, even though the phase 1 trial may not have ended or was close to ending, phase 2 was just allowed to start. Again, first interim analysis from phase 2 had to be available. The efficacy and the safety had to be, favorable. And that allowed phase 3 to proceed. And so it's not that we are actually skipping development steps. We are just running some of them concurrently when we have data available from the third step. And I can tell you guys, as a researcher and a clinical trialist, this was actually really challenging. I have never had to stop and adjust a clinical trial as much as I did with AZD and Janssen, which were the clinical trials that I had here at my site, because every time phase 2 data came out, they would make me go back and change the protocol or adjust the dose, or a new formulation would be available. And, that was just not fun because that's just not the way clinical trials are supposed to work. It was actually chaotic. There was a lot of issues with the participants, always trying to ask why things were changing the way they were. And it was really challenging, and it forced us to adapt and become very fluid at implementing these changes, which, I'm very actually proud of our center for the way we were able to handle that. But I want to assure you guys, this was not easy, and it was challenging to proceed like this. But we did not, skip any safety steps. We were not allowed to do that. The next thing I heard was OWS, or the studies that fell under the Operation Warp Speed umbrella, did not have any minorities or participants from communities of color. That was actually not true. That may be true for some of the early phase data. So, phase 1, which is healthy volunteer data, and maybe a little bit of phase 2. But phase 3, actually all of these clinical studies, you guys, had racial benchmarks that we actually had to meet in order to be able to enroll the trial. So, there was basically something that said a certain percentage of patients had to be Black or African American. A certain percentage of patients in these trials had to be Hispanic or Latinx. And, the reason that is because COVID-19 is really predominantly affecting communities of color for reasons that is just beyond the scope of this talk. I could really go on a soapbox about that all day. But in order to reflect, the burden of the epidemic, the phase 3 studies had to reflect that epidemic. And clinical trial sites that were not meeting those benchmarks, they actually permitted us, they stopped us from enrolling. If you didn't have X percentage of your participants, being Black or African American, they would just completely block your enrollment. And so I want to let you guys know that there was really a serious attempt and effort made to include diverse communities in the clinical trial. So I don't think that statement is true either. And then the last statement, which is kind of funny, but is not, because people actually believe this, was that Operation Warp Speed was formed to, make sure that Donald Trump had a successful election, especially if he was able to produce 300 million vaccine doses by the end of 2020. But clearly that didn't happen. We were not able to rise to that occasion just because of a lot of manufacturing issues. And the trials were slower to enroll than we thought they were going to be. But OWS had nothing to do with Donald Trump. It was actually Anthony Fauci, the public health community, the scientific and research community that came together and said, no, we actually really need to do this in response to what is actually a global crisis. So let's jump into the clinical trial data. The first data table you're seeing here, this is the New England Journal phase 3 clinical trial data from Pfizer. And, what I'm showing you guys there, if you can see my pointer, is if you look at vaccine efficacy, Pfizer really, rose to the occasion, right? It was 95% effective at preventing COVID-19 infection. And one of the things that you guys have to remember, though, is that Pfizer and Moderna both took place when the predominant circulating strain in the United States and globally was the original Wuhan strain, as it is now called, or D4160. So, the efficacy that you're seeing from Pfizer and Moderna, that is against the original Wuhan strain. And that does change a little bit as later vaccine efficacy data became available. So I just want to preface that with that statement. So 2 safety tables here. The first is showing you local events. What was the most common local event? Well, it was pain at the injection site. The second safety table is systemic events. And you guys can see in terms of systemic events here, the top 3 were fever, headache, and maybe myalgia, right? So totally sort of, not surprising. And that's going to be a common theme that you're going to see in all of the clinical trial data, safety data here as shown today. So Moderna was published also in the New England Journal of Medicine. And just to draw your attention to what the overall vaccine efficacy was, it was 94%. So kind of apples and apples going up against Pfizer there. And then in terms of safety, again, similar thing, guys. The top table is local events. You can see the top local event was pain at the injection site. And then in terms of your systemic events, your top 3, headache, fatigue, and myalgia. Moving on to Janssen. So this was a little bit interesting, right? Because, Janssen's overall efficacy for preventing COVID-19 infection, as you guys know, came out about 67%. And it was a little bit startling because, with Pfizer and Moderna, we were used to seeing 90%. So the world kind of stopped and was like, what is going on here? But the reason that this still got approved, guys, is because if you actually look at the outcome of severe and critical COVID-19 infection, people who actually became sick, requiring hospitalization or experienced death, the vaccine was actually 85% effective at preventing that outcome. And I didn't show that for Pfizer and Moderna, but it actually was about the same. It was in the high 80s, right, in terms of preventing severe and critical illness. And so if you just take a step back and look at this from a public health standpoint, 85% at preventing severe and critical illness is actually an excellent result. The flu vaccine never achieves that at any time point of the past. We've never had the flu vaccine be as effective at Janssen as preventing critical illness, patients who end up, either dying or hospitalized due to influenza. And so that's the reason the vaccine got approved. 67% is actually perfectly appropriate when hundreds of thousands of people are dying every day. But for the naysayers who didn't like that number, it's actually severe and critical illness that what we care about. That's what we're actually trying to prevent, right? People who get COVID-19 and have asymptomatic infection obviously tend to do very well. In terms of safety data from Janssen, local events here, the top one is pain at the injection site. And again, in terms of your systemic events, headache, fatigue, and myalgia are the top three, right? AZD, really similar story to Janssen. This is phase 2 data from AstraZeneca. Phase 3 trial data, even though it's been publicly reported, is not actually publicly available, meaning it has not been actually published in a journal yet. We are authors on that manuscript, and the manuscript is just massively delayed. I'm not sure what's going on with it, but we do know that the phase 3 vaccine efficacy data was 76% for AstraZeneca. Now, AstraZeneca was a fairly international trial. Pfizer mostly took place in the US. Moderna mostly was a US trial. It had a few sites internationally. That was not the case for AstraZeneca or Janssen. They both were very international trials, with Janssen actually having a significant proportion of its patients coming from South Africa. So you always have to take that in mind when you're thinking about that vaccine efficacy, because a large proportion of that 67% I just showed you guys is actually probably the B351 South African strain, which we know none of the vaccines do very well for in terms of that. So if 70% for AZD isn't looking good, which, I personally think from a public health standpoint, it looks good. If we look at severe and critical illness, people who's requiring hospitalization and having, a very high score on the WHO clinical progression scale, people who got the vaccine, there was no cases of that, guys. And so that is why, the WHO did choose to give AstraZeneca an emergency use listing. It's a very effective vaccine at preventing hospitalization and death due to COVID-19 infection. Safety summary of the AstraZeneca vaccine, it's not very well detailed in that paper, so I kind of just sort of made a little safety summary slide for you guys. Again, top local reaction was pain, top systemic reactions, headache, fatigue, and myalgia. Because of the neurological issues and the thrombotic issues with the vaccine, I did want to show you guys, I tried to pick that out of the data in the Lancet paper, showing you guys that, in the trials, which had hundreds of thousands of people, guys, the percentage of, transverse myelitis, thrombosis, neurological events was quite small. And if you actually look at the details of the paper, none of those events were attributed to vaccine, according to the investigator. Here is Sinopharm. So this is the Chinese inactivated viral vaccine.
4 minutes.
This is actually phase 1 and 2 data. And I just wanted to show you guys here that almost 100% of people develop neutralizing antibody with these vaccines. They don't have their efficacy data published here. These slides are very busy, but the numbers in these groups are very, very small. And pain was the most common reaction, with fever and fatigue being the second most common reaction in the Sinopharm phase 2 trial. Covaxin, sort of very similar. Let me just draw your attention to the amount of people who develop neutralizing antibody. Actually, what happened here? So as you can see, in terms of anti-spike antibody, almost 100% of people develop neutralizing titers. And then they actually looked at a couple of other things, and actually almost 100% developing neutralizing titers day 56 out from the vaccine. Covaxin, very similar. Pain at the injection site was the top local reaction. In terms of systemic reactions, we have fever, and headache, and malaise. So, they all kind of sort of look quite similar, right, in terms of how well they work and their safety. Variants, very quickly. The UK strain is the predominant global strain right now. It accounts for almost all of the cases in the United States. This is actually old data. It's up to now 75% of US cases. All of the vaccines actually do pretty well against the UK strain, okay? And so none of the booster variant vaccines that you're going to be seeing coming out soon are against the UK strain. They're actually almost all focused on the South African strain. Currently, the South African strain accounts for 1% of cases in the United States right now. And actually, none of the vaccines do that great. Pfizer has some lab data that modeled and predicted 75% efficacy, but we don't have any human data that shows that number stands up so far. Janssen actually does have 57% efficacy and Novavax 60%, and that actually is human data from its phase 3 trial because they did have South African sites. The Brazilian strain is very similar to the UK strain. We think that most of the vaccines are going to do pretty well against that strain. It's kind of wimpy, and it currently is accounting for 5% of cases. The California strain and the New York strain, which are homegrown strains here in the United States, there's not a whole lot published about vaccine efficacy against those strains. That's currently an active topic of investigation. And then you guys know there's a lot of press about the Indian strain. It's accounting for about 1% of US cases currently, according to the surveillance data right now. And actually, India has published a couple of papers showing that Pfizer and Moderna do seem to work. And there's actually a paper looking at Covaxin, and that actually does seem to be effective as well. My sense is that they're probably just not giving enough of it. So here are my last few slides. I think I hopefully addressed a lot of these. COVID-19 vaccine can lead to COVID-19 infection. Not true. You guys know we're only given spike protein. We don't give the whole virus, so that just is not true. I think I've addressed this safety issue here. We don't have long-term safety about the COVID-19 vaccines at this time. That is coming, but based on the fact that they all are based on traditional vaccine technology, we do not believe them to have any important safety issues. And I have a slide about the clots coming up soon. People who have anaphylaxis to something should probably proceed with caution when trying to get a COVID vaccine. They should have their EpiPen available. Currently, the CDC does not recommend patients who've had anaphylaxis with other products to get a COVID-19 vaccine. That is actually the guidance right now. The COVID-19 vaccines do not have an increased risk of neurologic disease when you compare the incidence to the general population. So if you look at patients who have Bell's palsy with COVID-19 vaccine, and then look at patients who did not get the vaccine, who just have Bell's palsy in the general population, it's actually a lot higher. And they've done that for a number of neurological diseases at this point. The COVID-19 vaccines don't have chips in them. I have them in my pharmacy, and they do not have chips. The COVID-19 vaccines do not contain aborted fetal cells. Aborted fetal cells are used in a lot of the confirmation steps in vaccine technology to prove the vaccine works. But none of the currently available vaccines use fetal cells in the manufacturing. The COVID-19 vaccines don't enter the nucleus at all, and so they cannot integrate into your genetic DNA. The COVID-19 vaccines do not affect fertility. There is not that rumor that the spike protein looks like a protein on the placenta. That turned out not to be true. And the website that actually started that rumor, which was a German website, has subsequently been taken down. So let's talk about clots real quick. And this is sort of, I'm going to make this my last slide here. So you guys know that there is a relationship between the viral vector vaccines and clots. Here you can see some of those details, neurological and GI clots. Mostly women of childbearing age. It looks a lot like heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. It's thought to be an autoimmune mechanism behind it. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of data about this right now. This is a topic of active investigation, and we are doing our best to figure this out. For my woman of childbearing age, I personally encourage them to get an mRNA vaccine. And that's my personal recommendation right now if it's available to them. But I'm going to end here because I've left only 5 minutes for questions. So I am going to turn it back over to the host to take any questions that may be in the chat.
Thank you, Dr. Rolle. And so if you have any questions, attendees, please raise your hands. In the meantime, I guess one of the questions locally is that we have a mixture of the Covishield, which is manufactured by a different company as AstraZeneca, although it's the same basic vaccine. Are there any issues in terms of mixing those vaccines? Should we be concerned?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And, you know, the hot topic, so people should not mix different vaccines by different manufacturers. And so my answer to that is going to have to be no. Like, you shouldn't get probably an AstraZeneca vaccine and then get Covishield as your second dose. That's not recommended right now. But truthfully, from a scientific standpoint and purely from a physiologic standpoint, it is actually the same vaccine. It uses the exact same viral vector. It's just a different manufacturer. So I personally cannot understand that recommendation, but from a safety standpoint, because it hasn't been studied and it's a data-free zone, the recommendation is not to mix them right now.
In terms of hesitancy and anti-vaxxers, you are originally from the Bahamas. We seem to have a high level of physicians who are on the fence or even against the vaccines. Do you have any thoughts about that and recommendations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually did a CME on vaccine hesitancy the other day, and there were actually even some important things that I learned from, developing the content for the CME. To be honest with you, I think it's just, you can only present the data and you can only present people with information and let them decide. I think the preliminary studies that we have on vaccine hesitancy show that every single time you talk to a patient or someone about the vaccine and you just remind them about the clinical trial data, or you show them the safety data and the actual facts, every single time you do that, you kind of maybe shift some thinking, or you hope that you do shift some thinking. And even though I personally seen that in my patients who refuse to get the vaccine, and I just, shared with them the clinical trial data. And every time I see them, I just touch base with them. Hey, what do you think about the vaccine? Has things changed for you? And, slowly but surely they're coming back to the clinic and they're like, Dr. Rolle, I got my vaccine. And I'm like, what? That's amazing. So I think honestly, all we can do is continue to have the conversation. It's almost like smoking cessation. You continue to have the conversation. You try to employ motivational interviewing technique, and you just present people with the information out there. And at the end of the day, it's up to them. But I think every time we do that, we come a step closer to shifting the thinking in terms of that.
Okay, so we have two questions, and this will have to be it for this session. Should persons who had documented COVID-19, recovered completely, had a negative test, and documented to have antibodies be issued a vaccinated status? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I do not. I 100% don't think that at all. The commercial COVID-19 antibody that at least is available by Quest and LabCorp here in the US, and I'm assuming that the very similar assays are available down there, that has actually not been shown to be neutralizing antibody. We've never been able to show that the antibody that's present detected by the test after COVID-19 infection is the same thing as neutralizing antibody induced by the vaccine. There is zero data that that's the case, and that's why I cannot, as an infectious disease doctor and researcher, recommend that to be the case. As a matter of fact, my patients who get COVID-19, I really push them to get the vaccine 14 days after they recover from infection, which is currently the CDC guidance.
Okay, and great presentation, Gerard Albury. Could you elaborate on why you advocate Moderna vaccine for women of reproductive age?
So that's an interesting question. It's a public health question, guys. So in the United States, I have the ability to give someone else a different vaccine. There are options here. Women of childbearing age don't have to get a viral vector vaccine, right? And so, my women of childbearing age, especially those who's concerned about the viral vector vaccines with the thrombosis, I say, listen, I still think you should get a COVID-19 vaccine, but why don't you go to a site that has an mRNA vaccine? I think people should get a COVID-19 vaccine. I think everyone should get a COVID-19 vaccine. The reason I acknowledge that I push in that direction is because it's an available option here to not get a viral vector vaccine. If I was practicing back home or on the islands or somewhere where there were only viral vector vaccines available, my advice would be different. It would.
Thank you so much. Very stimulating talk, even at this time, 1 year later. Thank you, Dr. Rolle.
Thanks so much, guys.
Okay.